will consist of a set of questions posed to a renowned expert in the respective domain. In this way, it will connect the School of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences with leading institutions of higher education and liberal arts across the country and the world. The objective of today's question and answer session is to introduce students to the field of translation history and translation studies. Our esteemed guest and speaker for today is Professor Leeuwenhoust. Professor Leeuwenhoust is an emeritus professor of French and Francophone literature and of translation studies at the Research Unit of Translation Studies. He has been trained in French and comparative literature as well as in translation studies at the universities of Namur and Leuven, where he obtained his PhD in 1982 with a thesis on the early 19th century translators and interpreters of Antwerp University before moving to KU Leuven in 2000 until his retirement at the end of 2020. He's a member of the editorial board of Target, International Journal of Translation Studies, the co-editor of a series, Traductology, at Artois Press University, France, and member of the Academia Europea. His actual research topics cover the relations between translation and transfer, theory and practice of translation, historiography, migration, and plurilingualism. I now invite Sir to tell us more on translation history.
Thank you very much. And if I may say a few words of gratitude, I always find it challenging to speak through the virtual media because I cannot really see the audience. I cannot see the feedback which your faces would give me otherwise, and when we would have been in presence. But still, I was happy to be given this opportunity to talk about translation history and also to approach translation history from, I would say, a self-reflexive angle. When we are doing history, we are not always much aware about the actual presuppositions that are behind our historical work and which we should share with the scientific community. So this will be the occasion to talk about these issues more in particular. The set of questions is quite large. I don't know exactly which questions you will put forward. If you can just follow the list of questions numbered, that is very fine to me. But I must confess also that I will be unable to answer some of the questions because this is outside my field of expertise, but I have been writing down enthusiastically even some of my thoughts as they were inspired by the way the questions were phrased. So thanks for the questions as well. I suppose that I will leave you the initiative to guide the exchange and that I will answer question by question. So please go ahead.
Okay, so a very warm welcome to you, sir. I'm Riddhi Dhamanwala, one of the students of School of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, majoring in English literature, and I will be the one who will be asking you the questions today, sir. So let us begin. So, sir, to start with, what is your perception of translation as a translator and as a translation scholar?
Fine. That's a tough question, but it gives me the opportunity to recall the diversity of what you call perceptions, what I would prefer to call attitudes, because perception is more convenient for sensory experiences, while attitude involves also intellectual views and ideological positions. So I will more talk about attitudes than about perceptions of both translators and scholars with regard to the activity of translating and translation research. So let me start my attitude towards translation and the way it is carried out. On the one hand, so my practice of translation is rooted in my teaching on translation. And my teaching in translation has a long, as you know, or belongs to a long and venerable tradition. Already in the secondary school, I became familiar with the exercises called theme, and the version. Theme is going from language 1 to language 2, and version is the other way around, from language 2 to language 1, with the aims of learning old languages, Latin and Greek, and modern languages, English and French and so on. So in these cases, in learning to translate in the secondary school, source text and source culture were considered prestigious and deeming respect. And so I adopted spontaneously, like my peers in school, a subservient view on my task. To put it briefly, in these days, translation was understood as an interlingual operation determined by a mixture between what Gideon Turi, the Israeli scholar who coined the term norms, the concept of norms, called adequacy on the one hand and acceptability on the other. And so, as a professor of translation, I followed the same path. And one should not forget that there was not always room in these days to discuss strongly deviant or different translation norms that would not find the middle balance between adequacy on the one hand and acceptability on the other. With the exception perhaps of adaptation, which then only started to enter the curriculum of the university. By the way, one should not forget either that literary translation is only but a part of translation training at universities, where different modes of translation started to be discussed. We, of course, entered a different view and a different approach towards translation. And now, of course, we do know that translation can cover many, many different types or genres, including cultural translation, which in fact may to some extent be a paradoxical concept, because it virtually can exclude translation proper, as we know. So this is my track as a translation student, learner, and teacher, to keep the balance between adequacy and acceptability within the frame of interlingual translation. As a historian of translation and a translation scholar, I have learned quite early during my university studies and my research that translation has always been a multifarious concept, which escapes general or abstract ruling. So I had to get out rapidly from the precise balance between adequacy and acceptability in order to understand the forms and functions of translation in history. So the better way to look at translation from a scholarly viewpoint, and a historical one in particular, is to view it from within. This is to say, to reconstruct the logic of meaning and form, which is determined by the interplay between numerous factors, the existing traditions to which a translation may belong or against which it may react, the many names and functions given to translation itself, the center-periphery positions of the languages that are involved in translation, the specifics of and the relations between the translating genres in the legal domain, in the technical domain, in the philosophical domain, in the literary domain. And also to take into account the evolution of translation research itself. The views we have designed on translation have evolved also by research, and we have understood the semantic complexity and the semantic flexibility of the translation concept, and the wide array of practices, mainly discovered since Jacobson's article or distinction between interlingual translation, intralingual rewording, and intersemiotic translation, as well, of course, as the shifting views on translation that emerge notably in the post-colonial context. And to translate is also to exercise a form of power by pushing a language in a dominated position, for instance, but also a way of resisting power by changing messages, by manipulating dominant languages in which translation is made, and so on and so forth. So we have now a very broad, interesting, enriched view on translation which did not fit my own attitude or perception, if you wish, of translation that I had when I learned to translate and when I teach translation, at least for a large period of my career. So to summarize my answer, I could say that I have two hats on my head, and I see no conflict between them because I'm aware of my own history and of the history of translation. Now, maybe this is something that is implied in the question. I'm not sure that research on translation will fundamentally change social views on translation, at least not in broad circles. Translation has a meaning which is spontaneously captured by the majority of people in a society and which does not fit the complexity of the concept of translation we have as students or scholars. Today, we are facing scholarly attitudes which are partly presentists. And what is presentism? It's a way of approaching the past through the lens of our present concerns. We know that we are facing ecological challenges and climate change and other social issues, including issues regarding minorities. So presentism is distant from activism, which is a more radical attempt to change the future on the basis of present challenges. So these engaged or committed forms to do research are there. I'm not sure that they will easily or rapidly transform the popular views on translation that are still prevalent in society. Even if I'm not myself a presentist or an activist historian, I'm very much aware of the underlying views and attitudes on translation that are there and that might, in the longer term, perhaps let's keep a bit optimistic, also change very, very old views on translation that are a bit, well, inexpressive, I would say, of the complexities of the world we are living in now. That would be my answer to your first question.
Thank you so much. So our next question is, so could you please dwell a bit on translation studies and how it has evolved in the last 50 years or so? And are there any important milestones to which, which according to you have turned out to be the turning point for translation studies?
Well, I like this question because it's an irritating one. It makes me a bit activist, especially the phrasing in the last 50 years or so. I have just written an article on that issue, which is entitled About the History of Translation Studies as a Discipline. It just came out in a Routledge handbook, one of the many handbooks of Routledge that Routledge devotes to translation. It's a Routledge handbook on translation history. The main point I wanted to make in that article is that it is more than challenging to write such a history of translation studies. First, I dislike the popular story prevalent in the history of translation studies that translation studies is the result of a lasting development that started in the 1970s, has moved quickly forward since then, and it's still far from having reached an advanced stage of maturity in the early 21st century. Because it's irritating, because the introduction of such a historical perspective on the emergence of translation studies during 50 years shows a strong caesura between the past 50 years or so and the present. To put it bluntly, the pre-discipline and the discipline. As if before 1950 or 1970, there have not been intelligent people saying wise and interesting things about translation that we should discard. This makes me a little bit angry, such a view. And still, as a historian, I have the task to try to understand why we have such a view on the emergence of the discipline translation studies. I think it is the outcome of two equally widespread understandings of the principle of change in science. And these two principles are borrowed from Thomas Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn's famous inventory of models of evolution. The one model to explain change in science is the growth model. Science progresses by accumulation. We know more today than people knew yesterday. The other model, equally popular in translation studies, is the model of the paradigm shifts, which is expressed by the notion of turn in our discipline. It's worth pointing out indeed that the history of translation studies features both models, the model of science, growth, and the model of shifting models. Translation history, in comparison with other language disciplines and some social sciences, handles such a view of growth and shift in a more radical way when compared with other languages, with other disciplines. For instance, the paradigm shift models is by no means acknowledged in linguistics. In the history of modern linguistics, you do not see the concept of shift, paradigm shift, appearing simply because there are too many competing groups of scholars and schools. There are too few generally accepted basic concepts and methods. Still, many handle in our discipline the concept of turn, like Snell Hornby herself introduced it. So who exactly is proposing such a view on paradigm shift? Well, I would say those who belong to an intellectual tradition that is labeled translation studies with capital letters, making use of English, publishing in Anglophone, European and American media, which is publishing houses, journals, conferences. But in fact, as you know, all cultures have their own labels and intellectual traditions that do not fit necessarily the presentation of the history of translation studies. I am myself quite familiar with the French traductologie, and I wrote an article about early French traductologie, early, in fact, in an inadequate term, because there has been traductologie since the beginning of the 20th century, and many very fine scholars and ideas have made very sophisticated theories, which are more sophisticated sometimes than theories that have been elaborated after the 1970s. And you could go on. Portuguese estudos de tradução, Polish traductologia, Afrikaans vertaalstudies, and you have no doubt in India terms, concepts that cover exactly the kind of intellectual endeavor, the emergence of knowledge on translation that has a very long history. And of course, each of these traditions may nurture specific interests, but all these should keep or find their place both in translation studies and translation history. So it becomes perhaps more interesting to wonder who decides when a turn occurs, that a turn occurs, why a turn occurs. And influential people indeed very often promoters of a turn in which they play a role. This happened, for instance, with the cultural turn. In 1990, a book was published by André Lefebvre and Susan Bassnett in which they claimed that there was a cultural turn. So this was a way of initiating a cultural turn. Of course, in order to be successful, turns must be attractive enough for others, which is the case frequently with the majority of young students who need a topic for research, a method to carry out research that are considered innovative, that may help to give them grants to start up research, to find ways of publishing research in major journals, and so on and so forth. So, sure, this is not for me to say that there are no turns. No, turns do occur, and one may distinguish milestones, and those that have been mentioned so far have been acknowledged by many. We do have a cultural turn, we do have a sociological turn, we do have a media turn, we do have a pragmatic turn, and so on and so forth. But the fact that there are turns is one thing. For a historian, it's no less interesting to see what does not change, or does less change, or change in a different way, or should be labeled as a turn. As we all know, and I started by saying that we have some kind of, if you want, translation, which is very old and very strong and very largely shared in society, which some scholars would call memes of translation. Chesterton labeled such fragments or stereotypes. You have them in all languages. Translation is a bridge, and traduttore, traditore, and so on and so forth. They survive and continue to survive in spite of turns in translation studies, and even in spite of translation studies as a discipline. So what I'm interested in is not only what changes every 20 years or so, but also what does not change. Many viewpoints, many concepts, many methods simply survive. And there is no reason to think that they lost their value because of turns. For a historian, in other terms, continuity is as interesting like turns. And I'm not saying something special. This is an idea that has been put forward already by the historians of the Annales school in the early 20th century, who were interested much more in what they called the longue durée, what does not change in time, or what does only change very slowly, like the prices of grain, for instance, in medieval France did not change over a long period of time. This is interesting to observe, and not to focus only on the present or the small portion of 10 or 20 years in which we are doing our own research, and which some would like to foreground as being much more important than the other research or the other views that have been done before. This would be my answer to a bit longer answer, in fact, to your second question.
Thank you, sir. So moving on to the next question. How did you arrive at this area for translation history or historiography? And what made you take up the arduous research on translation history, sir?
Now, this is for me a bit of nostalgia. I retired, a year ago, and now I'm trying to say something about my own intellectual past. I'm looking back on my own career, and this is this answer will go in that direction as well. So I was trained in literary studies, and as a young student, I became fascinated by the literary relations between France and Germany during the 19th century, during the so-called Romantic period. And I was fascinated by it because I saw how the French discovered and started translating German poetry and drama, which was so different from the kind of literature they made. And so their endeavor seemed to me very intriguing and complex. They translated in a way I was not familiar with from my school period, because they translated in a very free way, and I couldn't understand why. And so it became really something that occupied my time, all my time. I fell in love with the 19th century and with translation history, and still I'm very interested in that period and in translation history of that period. Translations are among the very best barometers to gauge the differences between cultures, simply because you can compare in detail a translation with its original, and you will immediately find differences for which you may attempt an explanation. Is it the language that's different? Is it the literature that is different? Is there some ideological difference, and so on and so forth? And I find it much more fascinating to look at translations than to look at parallel texts in the target culture, to compare a German poem with a French poem that is not a translation of the German poem. Of course, you see differences, but how relevant are these differences? What do they actually say about views on style, views on poetry, views on ideology? Much harder to find out, whereas translations are really opening up your mind. So I wrote a master thesis on a French translation of, Goethe's masterpiece, Faust. And this translation was done paradoxically by someone who didn't master German. So, and he was 16 years old. He became a very famous writer. And strangely enough, his translation has remained the standard translation of Goethe's Faust in French, in spite of the fact I published a critical edition of that translation. It's full of errors, of misunderstandings, but nevertheless, he injected a poetic view, his enthusiasm in this translation that makes it still today very attractive. So after that master thesis, I started up a PhD. It has been mentioned already, a PhD on the influence that translations into French had on the evolution of French poetry between 1780, the end of classicism, and 1830, the high days of Romanticism. This PhD was heavily indebted to polysystem theory. I was at that time I had a very juvenile enthusiasm for the ideas designed at that very time, because we are at the end of the 70s, by the Israeli scholar Itamar Ibn Zohar. And one of the most striking experiences I had when I was a young student is that at that time we were looking for the absolute essentialist definition of what literature is. What is literature? Can we really find a shelter definition that covers it up all? And then exposed to him, when I met him in these years, with my concern, which was the concern of my generation. Everybody was trying to answer that question. And literary theory was very much concerned with the definition of literature at the time. And he says, well, definitions change in time. And so there might be a historical definition of literature today, but it's not more important, more valuable than definitions given of literature in previous periods or in future periods. And so the historical view on literature was so prominent in polysystem theory at that time that I was really attracted to develop it. And secondly, I was influenced by his idea that national literatures or literary systems, when they undergo some kind of an evolution, for instance, a crisis situation, he calls it a crisis situation, when you really move from classicism to romanticism, then these literary systems undergo, they steadily rely on translation. Translation gets a prominent function. It helps to renew genres, styles, themes, and other fundamental features of literary works. In parallel with my thesis, I worked with colleagues in Leuven on bibliography of French translations during the first half of the 19th century. And we produced a bibliography in two versions, a printed one and an electronic one on a CD-ROM. It was probably the first of its kind. Now we have many electronic bibliographies. The one we designed was already quite exhaustive, quite extensive. We had all translations collected, produced in France during 30 years. It was more than 12,000 titles. And we were astonished by the fact that, for instance, a source language, Latin, was still dominant during Romanticism. So during the Romanticism, we had also classicism, so to speak. So we had to change our mind. And what we also noted was that, for instance, children's literature in translation was very important, much more important in numerical terms than highbrow literature. And so we got that systemic idea of coexisting and interrelating genres to become a prominent aspect of that bibliography. So after that, I published books and articles on historical translation theory, and I still do today. At this moment, I'm supervising more than 100 contributors all over the world who are writing a cultural history of translation in 6 volumes that will be a global history of translation with a focus on cultural aspects of translation. And I still have other plans in the pipeline, including work on the 19th century. So the second question is, why have I been relentlessly fascinated by translation history? Well, I think that the main reason is that translation is such a fascinating practice. And it is fascinating because it's unpredictable. It may be very important when you think it is secondary. When I consulted national histories of French literature, there was no room for translation. I discovered that translation of which few people were talking was in fact very important. But sometimes also where you expect it's very important is less important in reality. So it's unpredictable. It is also chameleonic, so to speak, in its capacity to adapt to all context, all situation. It has fascinated me because it has been unjustifiably neglected by historians of language, of literature, of philosophy, of law, of the sciences. And now we are facing a real boost in translation history, which leads to the discovery and rediscovery. And still we have blind spots, numerous blind spots. When we start to look at translation from a transcontinental or intercontinental exchange viewpoint, then it opens up completely new spheres, which we simply were not aware of 50 or 60 years ago. And perhaps finally, I'm interested in translation because I work and live in a small country, which is a plurilingual country. We have, well, officially 3 languages. I will come back to that, Dutch, French, and German, a very small German community. But of course, we are now today facing in the streets in the city I live, we have some 50 or 60 languages. And when I walk in the city, I hear them. And when I go to the shop, I ask people, which language do you speak and how do you relate with others? Does someone translate what you're saying? And how do you relate to the officials of the community and that sort of question? So I'm really living in a community in which translation has been prominent since I was a boy. It has never been more prominent than today.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is, for students and for budding translation researchers, can you tell us in simple terms what translation history is?
I'm very able to answer this one, because history truly is an ambivalent term. First of all, history applies to the sequence of facts, of events, of ideas, of discourses, of persons, of text, and so on, that occur in time. By extension, history is also understood as the order of written account of these facts. So you have the facts on the one hand, and you have the mode of presentation of the facts on the other. And we have just one term to name both. And still, we should be aware of the difference between the two. So, translation history, in the second meaning, covers, in my view, anything, really anything that may be studied from a translational viewpoint. So there are two things that are important in translation history: the fact that it is history, that it deals mainly with the past, and that it deals with the past from a translational viewpoint. I have used, when in antiquity people learned to prepare an oratorical speech, for instance, in court, they had to think about all the elements that should find a place in their presentation. Who did the crime? Why was the crime committed? What was exactly the crime? Where was it committed? With whose help was it committed? Why was it committed? How has it been committed? I have used that guideline to identify the range of objects of translation history. What can be said about the sequence of facts of the past? And I use the Latin terms quis, quid, ubi, quibus auxilius, cur, quomodo, quanto, cui, bono. All this, in my view, can be a topic of translation history. Quis, what do we know about the translator? Life, background, career, ideologies, techniques, gender, and so on. Quid, what has been translated? And also what has not been translated. As we see through sociology, there is never an equal flow between cultures, between culture A and culture B, and between culture B and culture A. There is no symmetry, there is asymmetry. There is more in translation in one culture than ex-translation and the other way around. And great or big cultures, like Anglophone cultures, of course, they in-translate much less than they ex-translate. In my country, for instance, in my language, Dutch, we do not ex-translate much. We would like to see our authors being translated in other languages, but we do not achieve that. Only exceptionally do we have some international successes of books that are printed written in Dutch. So it's interesting to understand what has not been translated and why it has not been translated. Also, where are translations made, printed, published, but also where are they distributed and read? And here we enter the notions of center and periphery, but also small communities like cities in which translation is now extremely a hot topic to study, translations occurring in cities. Quibus auxilius, which instances offer which kind of support for translators and other agents such as publishers, but also which instances prevent or prohibit translation or censor translation. Think of political ideologies, religious texts, and so on and so forth. And then the big question, the most difficult one, why do translations occur? You could say because of interlingual gaps, the need to inform citizens, to give access to new ideas, younger forms, texts, and so on. But still, we didn't find the final answer. And anthropology is much interested in the emergent phases of translation in human history. But this research is only in its childhood, and we'll have to wait much more research in order to answer that question. Why does translation occur? Quomodo, how are translations made? Special attention has been given to the study of translation norms used by translators in specific periods, in specific places, and systems research, and including the research by Gideon Turi, has given an impetus to the study of translation techniques and translation norms. Quando, when do translations occur? Well, we have periods in which there is much translation, others in which there is less translation. We now have bibliometric tools to measure the percentages of translation in languages. Once I was at Harvard University in the library and I looked around, and after 15 minutes, I was almost in panic. And I asked the question to the responsible of the library, and I said, do you have books in other languages than English? And the answer was, I don't think so. The whole world is filtered through, well, all kinds of techniques, including translation into English. So French literature, German literature, Spanish literature, it's all available in English. And so it becomes Englishified today much more than in previous periods. If you compare, for instance, the place of a translating language like German in the early 20th century till the 1950s in Europe, it was a very important translating language. Now it is not anymore. So that kind of periodization is interesting from a historical viewpoint. And also to wonder whether, for instance, when you have literary periods, do these match exactly translation techniques or translation views? So do you have a romantic view on translation like you have a romantic view on literature? What I discovered is that they do not match simply. In all periods you have differences, and so we should look at the specifics of temporal categorization of translation. And then the last question is cui bono, who benefits from translation? What are the effects of translation? What are the functions, the uses in society? What happens with translation once they're carried out? And for me, this is very simply, in fact, what translation history is all about. You can select a question, or you can combine 2 or 3 questions. You can study a specific group of translators, for instance, or you can focus on a specific period, or you can look at a specific translating language. It all makes sense in my view when it is well done. It's not so that one sort of question is much more important than other ones. It depends on what you want to do. It depends on the methods that you make use of. And when it comes to discuss these methods, then we have the notion of historiography coming in the picture. Historiography traditionally is the history of histories. It is the history of the practices of history writing. And already in Rome, people were interested in the way histories were written of the wars in preceding periods, in the Greek period, for instance. By extension, historiography is understood as a self-aware mode of scholarly activity. It is not just writing history, it's also thinking about writing history. Of how should I write history? Which are the concepts that I need? Which are the methods? Which kind of specific expertise do I need when I want to approach a specific intellectual domain? When I write a history of legal knowledge in India, should I be familiar with translation history only, or should I have knowledge about law? Should I have a legal training? This is very interesting because more and more scholars are working on the history of translation in science. And there you see that more and more scientists, mathematicians, biologists are starting to do research in translation history, which is a discussion that is done at the level of historiography. Ideally, we will combine both in legal history, like we will do in translation history of literature, in which you have some literary schooling in comparative literature, or in literary theory. So that would be my answer to question number 4.
Thank you so much, sir. So moving on, our next question is why translation history matters, and also what is its special significance?
Well, I don't know whether it matters so much. That would be an issue for historiography. Let's discuss how important translation history could be. It's not sure that we will agree spontaneously on the importance of translation history for what? For translation studies, for translation theory, for literary studies, you name it, for the humanities and so on. But let's assume that translation history matters. And then I could easily find arguments to sustain such a thesis. You can refer to a number of initiatives that are being taken recently. You have special journals now devoted on translation history. Chronotopos is one such an journal. Studies in Translation History is another one. In Spanish, we have Revista de la Historia de la Traducción. We have a new book series as well with main publishers like Routledge, who issued a collection, a series on translation and interpreting history. We have a book series called Translation History, one in German, Studien zur Übersetzungsgeschichte. And this is new. This is new. New journals specifically devoted to history, new series specifically devoted to history. And we have also now something that I can recommend to everyone. We have a new history and translation network of translation historians. I can send you after this presentation some references, perhaps. We have a history and translation network. I was one of the co-founders, and we have more than 200 members now, perhaps 300 now, which is a lot. And still, it has just started. And we'll have a conference next year in Tallinn, in Estonia, to launch the network. So definitely, many people are working on translation history. We have large histories of translation that are achieved in many languages or are in the making, and so on and so forth. And so immediately the question pops up, why is history booming so much? And once again, this is a historiographical issue. You shouldn't do it, but I'm interested in historiography. So I can think of several hypotheses. Why today do we have so much interest in history? I think first, it took some time, but our view on history is changing. We had, perhaps in Europe more than elsewhere, I don't know, you will tell me, a view on history as a scholarly activity that should be absolutely neutral. You cannot be involved or committed in what you're doing. And this is going back to the view, the standard view on history writing introduced in Europe already in the early 20th century by a German scholar called Leopold von Ranke. Geschichte, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist. The facts that have actually taken place. And you should be as exhaustive as possible and as objective as possible. And I myself was also, when I was young, in my PhD period, so to say, I was very much convinced. And when we designed that bibliography, we say we have all the books should be in it. And we have only 95%, it's not good enough. We should have 100% of all the books. And of course, Hayden White introduced a new view on history writing, not the least because the position of history among the social sciences was declining. And if you wanted to show that history as such as a discipline was still mattered, then we had to change our way of dealing with history. And then we had also the idea starting up, developing fastly in history as the mother discipline, and then also in many branches of history writing of the disciplines, of other disciplines, including translation studies, that history is not disconnected from the present and the future. We cannot suppress our own selves. In fact, we rediscovered that people have said exactly that very long time ago, like St. Augustine in his Confessions already said that we have three types. We have the presence of the presence, we have the presence of the past, and we have the presence of the future. You cannot look at the future but from the present. You cannot look at the past but from the present. And you cannot look at the present but from the present viewpoint. So history is less some kind of a positive science than an activity, an intellectual activity that is looking at answers for questions that are rooted in our present lives and intellectual challenges. So lists of names and titles and facts, the kind of chronic which corresponded in the view of many to what history should be, has given way to quite different questions. And these questions are very prominent today, and I think this will keep up for a while at least. So this is a first thing, and history is successful because we want to find answers for the present by looking at the past. Second, I think in translation studies, a growing number of people have lost confidence in the idea of growth, in the ambition of science and technology to solve the problems of our time. And this goes against the grain of artificial intelligence and digital technologies. At the very moment when digital technology is growing and influencing more and more, at the very moment we are convinced that DeepL technology will enable smooth and efficient translations of good quality, we are more interested in what fits, what does not fit the general. And we like to come back to the specifics, the individual style of a writer and a translator, what makes it deviant from a norm. And DeepL will only be able to capture the norm, the largest common denominator, not the specific of a single approach. So we do not necessarily keep confidence in the ambition to solve, of science and technology to solve the problems of our time. In translation studies, we may have the feeling, and many have the feeling, that we do not advance anymore in many domains. In spite of the successive terms, and so we should reflect more on ourselves. Why are we doing what we are doing? What are we searching for in translation theory? What about our intellectual past? What about the basics of our ideas on translation and interpretation? What does not change? I already mentioned that. And in this respect, I think that history, and global history in particular, might prove beneficial to the future of translation studies, precisely because we try to deal with these basic questions. How has knowledge in the past been collected, been mapped, been distributed, been taught, been analyzed in the past? And what can our understanding of these fundamental questions dealing with the past learn us about the very fundamentals of translation, which are also present in today, even if we try to design models that discard the preconceived ideas, the naive ideas on translation. I'm not at all critical about naive ideas on translation, because as a historian, I have to acknowledge them. They are there. I cannot suppress them. Even if, as a theoretician, I would like to dismiss them, I cannot but say that they are there and have to understand it. And then I have a third reason or hypothesis to explain why translation history has been successful. It escapes intellectual uniformity as imposed. Maybe putting it a bit bluntly, we don't have that much time. You will understand that I have to skip the nuance a little bit. Translation studies tends to impose intellectual uniformity. while history shows intellectual diversity, including language diversity and cultural diversity. And for many, it's precisely the contemporary threat of the global that makes history, be it national history, regional history, continental history, or local history, quite attractive. And of course, in India, you are quite familiar with these issues. Such a look for diversity fits post-colonial views to some extent, at least, but it may also resemble, and that would be the side effect of it, a nostalgic looking back at the own past achievements, and not the least in Europe, which is paradoxical. We see now popping up in Europe national rediscoveries of the own translation tradition, and you see translation histories in Hungary, you see them in Poland, you see them in Czechoslovakia, you see them in Russia, and say, we have our history, and it has little to do with your history. So this is not the right way. We should move on, I think. We should try to see how knowledge circulates between traditions. And of course, the circulation will show the power relations as well, but it is also an occasion to look at what has been dominated and what has also been proposed as a kind of resilience, of resistance. As history moves on, we discover more of the specifics. We dig deeper in our own history. And this takes, for instance, place in France. We had a major thinker of the 1950s and 60s who has been completely put aside by translation studies in its modern international shape 20, 30 years later. But we come back to that thinker because his ideas are worth to look at. It's interesting, even if they have been discarded, we still can learn something from them. And that is the kind of interest that is, I think, well, not compatible, so to speak, with a nostalgic view, but rather to understand that diversity is really inscribed in the fundamentals of thinking about translation, and that you should not only look at the main trends that are dominating, but also at the dominated trends, and the interplay between the two is for a historian of paramount importance. So I think that the challenge for future translation histories will be to find a balance on the one hand, between on the one hand, the focus on the local, the national or the regional that has been discarded and forgotten. We have to discover it back, rediscover it as a token of cultural diversity, which is what our time needs, I think. And on the other hand, the focus to put on what interconnects us on a larger scale. I'm writing an article on that difficult balance, which will use the notion of subsidiarity. What you can study on a local level should be studied on a local level, but what you need to study on a higher level needs also to take into account more parameters. So that would be my answer to this question.
Thank you, sir. So our next question is that there has been a lot of debate on the methodology of writing translation history, and different scholars have come up with different models. So if someone were to embark on translation history, what would be the starting point, or what would be the starting points?
Yes, this is a question that very frequently pops up. How should we write translation history? Well, and we have a book by Anthony Pym dealing with that issue, but we do not have much thinking about methodology of writing translation history. But in fact, very simply, I would like to say that there is no reason to assume that translation history should have its own specific methodology. because it's a branch of history on the one hand, and it's also a branch of translation studies. And finally, it's a branch of the disciplines of which you study the historical evolution. So history of legal translation should, of course, take into account the methods designed by history as the mother discipline, should take into account what can translation studies tell us about translation, and what can legal history tell us about legal translation. So you have to find yourself all the time a position within that triangulation: history, disciplinary knowledge, and translation studies. And then, of course, you may look for the specifics that are linked to the kind of question you want to raise. And we will come back to, for instance, when I want to study the figure of the quiz of the translator, what kind of a methodology should I take up? So if you want to write a history of literary translation, for instance, you will be inspired by literary history. You write the history of philosophical translation, legal translation, scientific translation, and so on. You will have to look for the methodology coming from these branches. And on that basis, we can make use of different methodologies designed by history, by translation studies, and by the disciplinary branches. It depends, once again, on what you want to achieve. If you want to find more about translators, you could look at microhistory. You dig into the archives of one single translator, and you try to find as much information as you want. Not only translators, but also translation scholars. You might have noted that we do not have much biographies of translators, nor do we have a lot of biographies of translation scholars. And to design a biography of a translation scholar, for instance, someone who's still alive, you have a number of techniques that are used in psychology, which is deep interview techniques and questionnaires, which might be helpful. You see, I cannot go into detail, but you can borrow a number of methods from specific branches, depending on the kind of question that you want to raise in translation history. Microhistory, comparative history, connected history, oral history, memory studies, and more find applications in translation history. And we already have information available in the history of translation knowledge that I edited together with Yves Cambier in 2018. We have listed all the possible historical methods that may be of use or relevance for translation history. So once again, there is no specific route into the past. It all depends on what you want to study. Do you want to study actors? Do you want to study texts? Do you want to study ideas? Do you want to study specific places? Do you want to study specific periods? All this will be an invitation to look at historical methods in history that can be used to some extent together with other methods. So I would talk about mixed methods, in fact. This being said, one should keep in mind that the viewpoint is, or should in the best possible way, be translational. We should look at the past through the lens of translation, or an aspect of translational communication, which means that the outcome will never be a copy-paste of what others have found from their viewpoint. When you compare, and I often have done that, how does a philosopher look at the history of philosophical translation? Well, it will be different from the way a translation history is looking at the history of philosophical translation. And there should be room for both. You could not say to the philosopher, you have to shut up, this is my domain. And the philosopher should not tell you, shut up, you have no information on philosophy, you should shut up, that's my domain. It's not like that. There will be also always some overlap, perhaps also some competition, but I'm not very worried about a competition. There are not enough historians. So the more people work on the same topics, the better. This will yield more information. And there has been some debate indeed, especially among legal historians. Legal historians have worked on the history of translation, and translation historians have done well as well. And sometimes it leads to some discussions. Now, what are the steps? Because that was also a question, a sub-question. What are the steps that you should follow in order to write a history? Well, the first step is to define hypothesis. It's very trivial to say so, but it's crucial. It's not an easy task to say exactly what you are interested in, because very often we do have a vague idea or an intuition that needs to be checked. By checking it, you may deviate from your initial goal, which is fine. And people writing a master thesis or a PhD, they know that very well. Initially, they had an idea of what they wanted to do, but that idea very frequently has changed into something else. So this is an important step to look at the issue of the research question of hypothesis with an open mind. Secondly, you will have to make a choice between two major approaches, which are called respectively internal and external approaches. The first puts a focus on form and content. What are concepts, theories, methods, and so on, values also attached to translation. And the external approaches, they put a focus on context, on the social, the economic, the institutional, the political context of translation. And in general, or frequently at least, a project, a book project, or an article, or a master thesis or a PhD will look for a combination between external and internal aspects. And you will have frequently the design of historical context, and then you will have some textual study attached or following that. Third step, you will have to check properly whether the material is available. It's nice to have a hypothesis. It's nice to have an external or an internal approach, but do you have the facts at your fingertips? Do you have them available? You will have to go to the archives. You have to look in libraries, in bibliographies, and it's not sure that all of the material is available, especially when you look in the archives. You might encounter a problem because people who make decisions on what should be kept in archives have frequently considered translation to be a secondary activity, a less important activity. And so they have dismissed it very frequently. And it has disappeared, it has been destroyed. This is also the consequence of heritages. When you have books in your heritage, and someone has to decide which book will we keep. Oh, these are only translations. Let us throw them away. And if a translator has an archive where will his heirs keep these translations or the manuscript version of the translations, very often they are not worth much money, so they will also disappear. So this is something you cannot predict or know on beforehand, and so it will be a step in your research that might decide you to change your orientation. And the fourth and last step is, of course, the analytical phase, which makes use of one of the historical methods mentioned, which you would take from literary studies, sociology, book history, philosophy, and so on and so on. So I cannot say, once again, which steps are to be made in a strict order or strict choices that should be made. It depends on what you want to find out. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So moving on to the next question, I think it's again related to methodology that you just talked about. So how do you start when you have to write translation history?
Here, my answer will be extremely short. And it's the answer I always give my own students when they start up a master thesis. The difficulty, once again, and always is, and even for me, is still what exactly do I want to find out? It's not as simple as it seems. You are interested by something, your curiosity is stimulated, and you start to write down things, but still this is not a proper research question. To have it clear in your mind, you have to write it down on a sheet of paper, 1 page. And then I always tell my students, then you pay a visit to your grandmother, and your grandmother is not familiar with what you're doing. And then your grandmother is asking you, you are writing an MA thesis. Oh, that's nice. What it's about? And your answer should be, your grandmother, I will not explain to you. You should be familiar with this and that. No. You have to do it. And if you are able to explain in 5 minutes what you're doing, then you have a research question. Then you have a mastery of your topic. Because then you will immediately experience the spots in your hypothesis where clarity is lacking, where there are blind places, where you are less specific than you should be, where what you consider to be important perhaps is not as important as you imagined. What you think is convincing is not convincing, and so on and so forth. So if you are able to explain to someone outside your immediate environment, then you are probably on the right track. But there is no single track. I can only see 2 guidance principles. You should write good history, and you should write it through a translational lens. These are the 2 main conditions. And I cannot say on before or in abstract terms what is good history and which translational lens you should adopt.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So the next question is, your paper on methodology titled How and Why to Write Translation Histories is quite fascinating. And in it, you talk about the intellectual biography of translator. So can you please elaborate a bit on that?
Okay, I will gladly do. Translators are interesting figures, if only because of the unpredictability of their paths, of their careers. To become a professional translator, you do not, generally speaking, need a diploma. Interpreters is a different story, and even that depends. So you don't need a specific diploma or an established expertise in translating, although training is appreciated. Many legal translators have a training in, not in translation, but in law. Not all of them, however. Literary translators have generally no training in literary translation, perhaps in literature, is not sure. And of course, when you want to translate a book of Darwin or Einstein, you are better advised to have some training in biology or physics. So it went in the past. But it makes this unpredictability, this complexity, makes the study of the translator's intellectual biographies an interesting endeavor. All the more since translators do play important roles in history. And I will, as kind of an illustration, quote a passage or a set of passages that I brought together from the Leland Woodsworth's Translators in History, who put a focus on the translator and what he or she had achieved in the past. But I have added something to that list of roles played by translators, and which illustrates my point here. So what they put, for instance, is that translators have helped to design and standardize national languages. It's true, but the reverse is true as well. Namely, what I put, they have creolized and destandardized languages, which is exactly the reverse operation and which makes it fascinating. On the one hand, they have helped to shape new literary genres and techniques. It's true. You have thousands of examples of the role that translators have played in terms of shaping new genres. But I add that they have resisted renewal by extending the survival of all the genres and techniques. Still, translators are conservatory in some genres at least, which are quite popular, even today. Third, they have transmitted all sorts of knowledge across linguistic and political borders. That's what DeLille and Wordsworth say, and I say, yes, it's true. But they have also censored and manipulated the knowledge that has been transferred over borders, across borders. They have mediated between enemies. Yes, they have also sustained conflicts between groups and countries. They have defended the weak. Yes, they have also extended the dominance of the strong. They have been the victims of power. Yes, they have also been the instruments of power. They have made other cultures digest. Oh yes, they have also made them impenetrable. I can give an example later on of that. They have made religions accessible to all. Yes, they have also narrowed their access to the literate only. They have conveyed new human values, and they have secured all values. Okay, so that complexity is one thing. How should we study translators is another thing. It's a complex undertaking as well. You might have heard about the idea of Andrew Chesterman in 2009 to develop a new branch of translation studies, which he called Translator studies. And I quote him, "The main object of this subfield would be to assemble all sorts of research which focuses primarily and explicitly on the agents involved in translation, for instance, on their activities or attitudes of translators, one. Secondly, their interaction with the social and technical environment, technical environment. And three, their history and influence. This is a vast program, attitudes, activities, interaction, and history. But even to deal with a single aspect seems almost a boundless undertaking, because categories such as agents involved in translation or activities and attitudes always include more than translators or translating proper. Agents involved in translation include non-translating agents, of course. You need publishers, you need readers, you need printers, you need institutions, and so on and so forth. And activities and attitudes, well, it's interesting. We have done some research on the chameleonic roles played by translators being politically engaged, being writers, being journalists, being lawyers, being I don't know how many things. Picking out only the translational activity is a bit arbitrary, so we have to look for more. And these three components which he distinguishes, they are in fact entangled also. As you may understand, attitudes depend on environment. History covers activities and attitudes as well as this environment. So it's a rather it's an interesting but a rather complex. And in fact, even if we do have a lot of research done on translators, that integrative view as solicited by Chesterman is rare. We mostly focus on one or two of these three poles. And maybe we can go on with question number 9 here. So please, you can read it, Ridi, if you wish. So
sure, sir. Yes. So Question number 9 is, why do translators matter so much? And also, I'm not sure if we attach that kind of significance to authors. And again, why is it so important to investigate so deeply about translators?
Well, I like this question because I'm not sure that translators matter so much. And so it would be interesting to see why people raise that question, why they think that translators matter so much. For me, translators do not much more than other aspects. I'm not that interested in translators. Nevertheless, I think it's worth to dig a bit into the topic, because the concept of translator is like the concept of author, and there has been so much research on authors and on the concept of authorship that we also have to do a similar job in the reflection on translators. But the concept of translator needs the distinguishing between three more or less distinct foci. First, a biographical person. Secondly, a social professional instance. And three, a textual instance. To look at the translator as a person, the first focus, means to reflect on his or her background, education, social and professional activities, and so on. And we do have a sensible amount of research available on translators' lives, activities. Could be monographies focusing on major figures active in more than one domain, such as Caxton, or collections of essays or portraits assembling professionals in a more or less exemplary way, like Wordsworth and Lynn have done in their book on translators through history. By the way, you could also do a similar thing on the figure of the translation scholar. And I have a young colleague who is preparing a biography of James Holmes. James Holmes is considered the founding father of translation studies. And I have known him when I was very young, when I was a PhD student. And he was known then both as a translation scholar and as a gay activist. So the second aspect, of course, did not really enter the sphere of our meetings and translation studies, but it was never a way. We knew about it, and sometimes he said he developed the issue of gender in his talks about translation, but he was also a poet, which we did not really know. This was part of his personality that was not really visible to us, and he was a translator as well. So he had a complex personality, and now people are trying to find out more about that complex personality of a translation scholar. Well, what does such a work, a biographical work, lead us? Well, it may help us to overcome traditional stereotypes such as the invisibility of translators, or the complex and sometimes contradictory positions of translators. We have learned, for instance, that the American scholar De Man, who was in fact of Belgian origin, was living and working in Belgium before the Second World War. And just after the war, in the in the middle of the 40s, he left Europe and moved to the United States, where he became a very famous professor in critical theory, notably in the domain of deconstruction. But one of my colleagues found out that he was actively involved in the Nazi propaganda in Brussels. He was writing articles in favor of and against figures and writers in Belgium, and he would no doubt have been put into prison if he had remained in Belgium, but he in fact escaped to the United States. So this is part of the complexity of the personality of the translator. There's one focus. Another focus is that on the translator as a more or less institutionalized instance in the cultural field. So what kind of a profession has the translator? What kind of academic qualifications, of professional certifications, of membership of associations, of experience and expertise does a translator have when he or she is active in a specific domain, a specific field? And once again, here we see a high variation. You have translators that are very strictly professionalized, but you have people that are working in a completely different environment, crowdsourcing translators, community translators, as we have seen recently in Afghanistan, fixers, people intervening in very specific circumstances and having some kind of an activity that does not fit at all the professional standards that put forward. So that kind of positions is quite interesting, and recent research has intensively invested in functional and also ethical aspects of the translator's work, translator's rights, power issues, censorship, and to cover all that up, people have some scholars, especially Daniel Simeoni, who passed away, unfortunately, a bit too early to develop his ideas on the issue further, on the habitus concept, which is a concept borrowed from Bourdieu. And habitus is I quote him, the elaborate result of a personalized social and cultural history. And the translator, being a cultural mind, quote him again, molded by the social environment and incorporated in the translator's act. In Germany, you have the Scopus theory and the Handlungstheorie, which stresses the expert role and specific action of translators in a complex network of actions through which the customer's expectations are achieved. Bruno Latour has designed an act-work network theory according to which actors and human and non-human actors are such by virtue of their interactions, their relations. So there have been a lot of, I would say, attempts to lay bare the characteristics of the second aspect, the social professional content of the translator. And then we have the most complex aspect or focus, which is the textual instance. The translator is a voice in the text. And one of the first to have put our attention to that is the Czech scholar, the Slovak scholar, in fact, Jiří Levy, who in the 1960s insisted already on the artistic and ideological attitudes of the translator as they become clear by individual lexicosemantic, syntactic, and prosodic features or shifts that take place between original and translation. And descriptive translation studies have entered their views on the insight by Levy, by Holmes, later on by Turi and many others, putting the emphasis in the early years, in the first generation of descriptive translation studies, so to speak, on the stylistic norms of what people call then the translator's behavior or strategy or poetics. The persona poetica of the translator became of paramount importance in these years. What kind of a stylistic, poetical individuality can be found, or group features can be found in the textual expression itself. Later on, we had more attention for the ideological role played by translators and still part of the textual instance. But it is not easy to do research. Hence also my conviction that it is the most complex instance. Most of the recent research to discover the textual instance, the figure of the translator, follows two separate paths. The first one looks at the representation of the translator or the interpreter within fictional or autobiographical work. There is a lot of fiction produced in which translators and interpreters play a prominent role. Some examples: Ingeborg Bachmann's Simultán, José Carlos Somoza, La Caverna de las Ideas, The Mission Song by John le Carré, Jacques Poulain, La traduction est une histoire d'amour. So I quote from different languages because in different literatures we do have the translator put forward either as a character, sometimes also as a narrator, as is the case with the fascinating book La Caverna de las Ideas by Somoza, taking place in ancient Greece. Plato and Aristotle are vague characters in the background of the novel, and the main narrator is in fact a translator. That you have hundreds and hundreds of examples in many languages. You may refer also to movies like The Interpreter, Lost in Translation, Babel. We have songs, we have paintings, we have photographs, we have sculptures, which all are attempts to produce a scenography of the translator, which frequently contains a correction, a critic, a parody on existing popular views on who the translator is. And this is probably one of the main reasons why many translators and self-translators or bilingual writers have indulged with these changed representation. But still, such representations are much easier to describe than the second path, which is the discursive form and function taken by translational enunciation, the voice of the translator in translations. And the voice of the translator in the translation occupies two spots or discursive spaces in the text: the paratext, a prologue, a preface, a postface, a footnote, which are rather rare. So the main space in which the voice finds expression is the text, is the translation. And this path has given way to a rapidly expanding subfield, opening space for debate about what exactly is that enunciation, or do we have an enunciation that is different from the auctorial voice, and what kind of cohesion does that voice have? Is it a proper voice, an autonomous voice, or is it a point of view? Is it perhaps something that is a posture, an ethical attitude, a way of presenting itself? We are still in full doubt, and we don't know exactly how we get further, because to some extent, when you see a shift taking place in a translation, you could say, here we see an instance, a token of the voice of the translator. But when you do not see a shift, when there is no visible shift, what does that mean? Is the voice of the translator penetrating the absence of shift as well? So these are difficult epistemological questions. And I will end up that question with that here, with that answer.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is that you have also dwelt on the other factors that influence a translation. So what are your thoughts on the way patronage influences a translation?
Well, patronage is a concept that was coined by André Lefebvre, if I'm not mistaken. André Lefebvre was a Belgian scholar who passed away very, very young, in fact, I have known him when he was active as a colleague professor. Well, he was my superior, but not my superior. He worked in a different university, but I knew him when I was a student. And the concept of patronage has been integrated, I think, later on in a broader concept, that of agency or mediation, which are now, I think, more current denomination of influencing factors, of influencers on translation. Translators are part of complex networks of agents, like Bruno Latour has put forward, or like the Scopus theory of Vermeer has put forward. Translators are commissioned by authorities or by publishers who may provide them with more or less specific guidelines, as may do other instances as well. And I will give you some examples of less conspicuous patronages on translation. We had a very strong debate recently about who is entitled to translate Gorman's Biden inauguration speech in Dutch. It has been a debate in the newspapers, in the media, and even in the scholarly world. I will not deep into that, but there was a famous Dutch poet who was asked by a publishing house to do the translation. And she was female. And the publisher said, well, a woman should translate a woman. Okay, so we pay you for the translation. And then there was heavy criticism on the social media that the famous poet, Dutch poet, young poet, same age, also an issue, should have the same age to translate. She was white, so she could not translate the speech by Gorman. And she dropped. She was put under pressure and dropped And then there has been a really very interesting debate, which led to the decision to have a person coming from a former colony to do the translation. I have another example. The retranslation of a famous essay against colonialism by the Francophone Caribbean thinker Frantz Fanon. Some might know him, Peau noire, masque blanc, black skin, white masks. And we had a very good translator, Jean Hollyrook, who made a translation. And in his essay, Fanon frequently uses the term nègre, the French equivalent of nigger, a word that has become taboo in the last decades and that no one wants to use in the translation anymore in the Netherlands. And the publisher wanted to change the word nègre by the Dutch equivalent of black. And so the translator was put under pressure by the publishers to do so. But there was another influencer who exerted patronage on her work and who were the heirs of Fanon. And the heirs of Fanon, they claimed the use of nigger in order to keep the strong racist connotations visible and present today. So this was also a public debate in the Netherlands, and the decision has been made to keep up the term nigger, the equivalent of nigger in Dutch. By contrast, the publisher of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time obliged the translator to replace the word Negro by the word black. And here there was no other patronage or influencer to prevent the publisher of doing so. And when you see the two, you see the kind of influence that has been exerted today, as of course in the past, so many times. Translation views, translation techniques can also be imposed by official instances who commission translators to translate official documents, legal text, and so on and so forth. I have done myself quite some research on patronage exerted by hegemonic regimes that occupied Belgium from the French Revolution till the end of Napoleon, 1815. And this was extremely severe. There was no way of discussing translation as it should have been done. And other examples in the 20th century on which a lot of research has been achieved are the Nazi and fascist regimes in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, and also how control was exerted on translation and interpretation during communism, during the long Cold War. This is rather well studied now, and one can say that the role played by patronage is quite huge. Please, let's go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank
Let's
you.
move forward.
So the next question is that you have worked on 19th century translation space in Belgium, and coincidentally, 19th century was also a crucial period for India, considering the colonization and the imperial rule. Now, what were your principal findings of that research, sir?
Well, a lot. I will mention five findings. First of all, the main direction of translation was from the official language into the non-official language, from French into Flemish, which might come as a paradox. Flemish, later Dutch, named Dutch, was a dominated language since the Middle Ages. Belgium has been occupied by the French, by the Spanish, by the Austrians, by the Dutch, by the French, before Belgium emerged as an independent country, as a democratic kingdom in 1830. Before that, we were customized to the translation direction coming from the dominant language, which was Spanish or Dutch, Dutch and not Flemish, French. French was, in fact, the most dominant of all dominant languages in the history of translation in Belgium. The Constitution of Belgium mentioned in its second article, and it's still there in the Constitution. It's not a second article, it's an article later on. And the article, the second Constitution article, says that the use of language in Belgium is free, except for official acts and legal acts. So, the principle of the French Revolution, freedom, which the revolutionaries did not apply when it came to language use, was introduced in Belgium in the Constitution in 1830, but with a restriction, namely official acts. So anything that was important was in French, written in French, and had to be translated into Flemish. Flemish was spoken by the majority of the population. We had approximately, well, I can't say exactly, but the 2/3 of the population were Flemish speaking then. Still, Flemish was not accepted as an official language, and only French was considered a language with legal value. So you could not use a translation into Flemish as an equivalent of the official text written in French. And it lasted almost a century before Flemish acquired that status. So we are really in a translating nation, in a translating state between 1830 and 1898. But there was something worse that we found out, something really perverse, which the Belgians learned from the French. The French had used massively translation, but intentionally produced bad translations. Translations that were that one was incapable to understand. You know how important exact phrasing is in the legal domain, in the official domain. But they intentionally produced bad translations, which they printed side by side with the original version, and they did it with the law bulletin, which was imported in Belgium and imposed on the population. And then you could say, yeah, you can find it. This is the principle of the French Revolution. You can read your the official text. You can read it in your language. But they say we can't understand it. Oh, if you don't understand it, go back to the French text. It's much easier. So this was part of a policy to eradicate Flemish in Belgium. The Belgian kingdom did not have that intention. I cannot say that. They did not have the intention to eradicate Flemish because Flemish was the dominant language, numerically speaking, demographically speaking, in the country. But it sustained the ambition of the Francophone to continue to impose, as long as possible, French as the only official legal language. I'm sorry, your language is not good enough to become a legal language. So we have to stick to French. And French is the language of Napoleon, of the codes of Napoleon. It's an international language. It's the best language for Belgium. So please do not worry. We'll provide you with a source text that is excellent, even if your target text is not very good. Third remark, obviously, the Flemish reacted against such a strategy oriented towards the discrimination of a language that was not fit to become a legal language. So this reaction was conducted by journalists, by lawyers, who adopted the idea that translation was in fact very bad. This is not a solution for us, for Belgium. So what is the hurdle, the major hurdle for the recognition of Flemish? It's translation. We should get rid of translation. And if you need to get rid of translation, there's only one solution left, is to accept Flemish as being an equal language. And so a law was voted very late in the 19th century, which assumed that Flemish had an equal status as French. Did that lead to full equality? By no means, because the principle inscribed in the Constitution was the principle of individual freedom. So when you had a ministry or an office in the countryside in which the official was Francophone and a Flemish citizen entered the office and said, I want this and I want that, he got an answer in French, which he didn't understand, and say, why don't you speak in Flemish? Flemish is an official language. Yes, it's an official language. And I have freedom of speech, which includes freedom of language use, language choice. So this is perverse. And when you look at it in great detail, and I did so, I looked in the archives of small towns and cities to see what happened in the municipalities. And there was fight all the time for language rights. The same for the names of the street names, very tricky. Should we add Flemish versions to the street names? Yes, but it costs too much money. It takes too much space. It's not very efficient because people are customized to the French, and so we will not do it. And we will decide it democratically in the city that this will not change. It took till the 1960s. Do you realize that a basic legal tool which is civil law. Civil law, very important for the organization of a society. We didn't have a good version in my mother tongue, because I'm Flemish. In my mother tongue, we didn't have it before 1965. 1965, and Belgium was free in 1830 and proclaimed freedom of language in 1830. So this was my third point. The fourth point, the fourth finding was that we had a wide array of what I call transfer relations that aimed at further impregnating Francophone Belgian culture in the Flemish part of the country. So you had school books which contained translations, or transfer modalities, rephrasing, summaries, explanations, interpretations, press articles, introduction to legal manuals. So when you look at translation, it is surrounded by other techniques of interlingual mediation, which are very important to give a place in our research as well. And then fifth, and not an important finding, something very astonishing, is a reverse movement, a transfer, more than translation, going from Flemish into French. Why? No translation, I explained it. Translation went from French to Flemish, but transfer went from Flemish to French. Flemish had a very large and prestigious cultural patrimony. The founding of Belgium was based on that patrimony, as it was in many European states. We do have a prestigious past, so we are entitled to be considered as a nation in its own right today in the 19th century. You saw that in Italy, you saw that in Spain, you saw that in the Netherlands, you saw that in Germany. This constant reference to the achievements of the past, which were a legitimation of the present. That patrimony was made of architecture. When you go to Belgium, you can visit these beautiful examples of Gothic architecture. And we had also painting. The Flemish primitives were very well known internationally, but they were Flemish and they were called like that. And so Romanticism and Belgian Romanticism tried to find a way of combining the new language, the official language, and the Flemish patrimony. And that kind of a mixture of Flemish themes, Flemish objects, and the French language made a combination which was very successful internationally. People admired the capacity of Belgium to integrate the Flemish patrimony and to present it to the world in the French language. So a very hybrid, complex combination, which was quite successful for some time. But the price to pay was, of course, that the Flemish could not have their language carry their own patrimony. The need to use French was accepted, well, half-heartedly, I would say, by the Flemish in the 19th century. And then, of course, the basis was laid of the Flemish movement at the end of the 19th century. And unfortunately, it got an impetus in the First World War, where the Germans thought of founding a European pan-Germany, say all the countries in Europe that speak a Germanic language should come together. And that was, of course, a very alluring perspective for many Flemish in the First World War, and secondly in the Second World War, and of course led to collaboration with the occupant between part of the Flemish-speaking population. It was not shared by the majority of the Flemish population. So these are the main findings of my research on translation space in Belgium. It's still not achieved, because you should go to as many places as possible to find out how people negotiated language uses in practical, taking into account the official regulations and also the kind of resilience that you discover also in the population against these oppositions. Okay, that was for question 11.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Sir, I am so sorry, but we are running out of time. I think we will have to keep it short and wrap up. So I will be asking you the last question, sir, and then I think we will open it to the audience because I think there are attendees who have a couple of questions. So our last question for today is, what would be your advice to young and budding students and researchers of translation studies and translation history?
Well, of course, this is not easy for me to answer that because I don't know really the setting in which you are working and should get more information. But generally speaking, I would say, and it's rather trivial what I'm going to say, is try to read and try to discuss among you found groups, also students and scholars, interested and ready to meet on a regular basis to discuss readings, to discuss research experiences, also to be informed as rapidly as possible of what's going on in the world. And you should follow newsletters like the newsletter Translation News, which is distributed freely by the Center for Translation Studies of University College London. So there you find lots of information on new books, and some books are also in open access, so you can easily find through internet more information about topics or methods or theories in translation history that you are interested in. And then secondly, I think that the better way to move on also is to try to find common ground for a project which you can share with a number of people based on a specific language or set of languages, a specific area, a specific time period, a specific domain, and discuss it, and perhaps also try to take part in conferences, if necessary, in virtual conferences, which are frequent. Yesterday, I registered myself to 2 conferences on translation in which I'm interested in. And yeah, you just remain at home and you learn a lot. And maybe also try to get institutional support, for instance, by becoming a member of the Translation History Network. Registration is free, and you have access to, well, a newsletter, information, but also to the bios, the CVs of many other people with whom you might be interested to exchange. I think that are some of the advices that I could give.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very insightful session. So I think now I will open platform for questions. I think we already have 5 questions from attendees, so we'll take that upward. So, sir,
Riddhi, we will take 1 or 2 questions and wind up.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Rita Mishra's question is there.
Rita Mishra's question. Okay, sir. So I think it's in the chat window.
Okay, I have it written here, so I'll.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So we have one question from the attendees, and that is by Ms. Rita Mishra. How can beginners translate oral stories into writing?
I'm sorry. Could you please repeat the question?
How can beginners translate oral stories into writing? I'll add it to the chat box too.
Could I look at the chat box? Because
yes, sir. Yes, I'll add it.
Okay. And at what moment was the question raised?
Okay.
She has added just now, sir.
Yes, sir. I have sent it just now, sir.
Just now? How beginners translate oral stories into writing.
Yes, sir.
Oh, yes. Oh,
So I think this question was raised after you answered question number 5, which was why does translation history matter so much and what is its special significance? I think it was after that I think.
Yes, yes. Well, it's an issue that challenges not only translation studies, it also challenges anthropology. Anthropology has been occupied a lot with what some call thick translation, taking into account the complexity of the reality and of the saying, the oral stories that are told, and that should be registered. Yes, it's an issue that is becoming more prominent in translation studies thanks to initiatives taken by a number of people. There is a conference in Tel Aviv next year to which I will go on intralingual translation, and there are publications also coming up. It was a little bit neglected in research, translation research, for a long time. So how remaining in the same language we move from orality into writing. Yes, I think people like Walter Ong and others in anthropology have been dealing with that issue. But I could not really say more than that. So at this point, I'm sorry. This is not my field of expertise.
So I think we have one more question. We have a question from I don't think the attendee has a name, but the question is, what are your views on the role of translation in development of a literary system, and are there any particular frameworks which can be useful for translation researchers looking into this kind of literary phenomenon?
Yes, I'm looking this is one of the early questions. So
yes, so I will put it in the chat box as well, so that.
Yes, please do so.
Yes.
Itamar Ibn Zohar distinguished between two major functions of translated literature in literary systems. On the one hand, translations, especially during transition periods, crises, attribute, or when the system is weak, so to speak. He speaks about weak systems, which are not well structured, which are incomplete, and so on. So the main function of translation in these circumstances, conditions, was to renew the repertoire. So there was an innovative function attached to translation. When a system is already well developed, when it has its genres well represented by autochthonous production and so on, then translation are only filling on the side, in the periphery, genres which were demanding. You have, for instance, detective novels. If you cannot provide enough of them, then you have to take translation. This was the case with the French literary system, which had a long tradition of detective novels, but still the demand was very high. And so people translated in order to complete or satisfy the demand. This viewpoint by Ibn Zohar was, I think, extremely successful for many, many researchers since 1976, the first moment he gave the presentation, and it was in Leuven. And therefore I remember the year because I was a student then. and it has been published time and again in his own work and used in the work by many people. So translation can play two roles, in fact, main roles, that of innovation in the development of a literary system and in sustaining specific traditions in the periphery of established systems. Now, yes, of course, it's very simple to put it in a binary way, and probably the simplicity and the binary character of the phrasing by Ibn Zohar is part of its success. When it comes to concrete systems and concrete functions of translation, things are much more nuanced, but still I find it appealing to start your research by distinguishing the two aspects. In case translation is innovative, then it tends to remain adequate, that it will probably try to keep up as much new features present in the source text into the translation. It can be a specific device, like for instance, free indirect speech entered many European literatures via translation with difficulties which were gradually distributed. In France, it was more tricky to introduce it than in the Netherlands, for instance. But it could also be specific subgenres or even entire genres. I have myself studied the introduction in French literature of the German ballad. The genre didn't exist, and it was translation that introduced it in a void space, so to speak, in a target literature, which was quite innovative then. So you have, of course, also themes and knowledges that are introduced. It can be typically limited to form, but there are many types of development issued through translation in new or in crisis situations.
Thank you so much, sir. I think this brings us to the end of our question and answer session. And thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, Riddhi. Thank you for the wonderful reporting and the excellent questions and the answers, which definitely have helped us all a lot. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Levin, the host, for his insightful talk and the answers. I believe today's session has been eye-opening for all of us. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. I would also like to thank our head of department, Dr. Kiran Singh, and a professor, Dr. Sunil Sagar, because of whom this talk became possible. I would also like to thank the entire IT team for the technical support. And lastly, I would like to thank my fellow classmates and the participants for being present today. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir. Bye, sir.